So in this video, I'm going to talk about hinges. Now, a hinge is kind of the sort of base operation for a lot of other mechanical moving parts. The reason why hinges are a challenge is because you have to solder very small things to sometimes larger pieces without soldering the whole thing together. You know, you have all these little bits that are really close to each other, but they need to be able to move independently. So the basic components of a hinge are, you know, obviously whatever pieces of material that you want to move independently of each other. Then you have your knuckles, which essentially are pieces of tubing, and then you have your hinge pin. The number of knuckles can vary, but typically you're always going to have an odd number of knuckles. And if you think about it like this, so the fewest number that you could have would be 3, right? Where you have 3 components in that hinge pin. The next and stronger hinge would be 5, right? So you have 3 knuckles soldered to one piece of metal and then 2 soldered to another. And then it can get progressively more. You could have 7, you could have a 9 knuckle hinge if you want, but typically you always want an odd number, because if I had an even number, my forces are going to be applied in uneven ways, okay? And so if I have an even number, I have more force, more stability on this side, and then more stability on this side. So it's your forces are acting kind of weird. So to cut the tubing, first I'm going to use this tool to do my measuring. So this is our just generically called tubing cutter jig. And then this tool is our $1 million tool. I could do all of my cutting just by using the $1 million tool, put the tubing in there and cut across this way. But since I have 5 knuckles and they all need to be about 1 centimeter big, I'm going to go ahead and use the tubing cutter jig here. I'm going to measure just tighten that down. Now, a trick for cutting tubing is to use a fine blade. Double check. Now I'm going to cut some more. Now that I have all of my tubing cut, I need to file the edges so that they are perfectly flat, and that's what the $1 million tool is for. So just tighten that in there so that it's sticking out ever so slightly. And then with my regular old file, You want to file until you're all the way down onto the $1 million tool. I need to do both sides. This hinge was constructed laying flat, which is fine. You know, perhaps you never need your two pieces of metal to come completely together. But if you see, hopefully this shows up in the camera, these will never come completely together. So for instance, this set of hinges was done completely together every step of the way. You can play around with different positions, different locations of where that hinge is. This is a sample that a student did for me a long time ago. She wanted to make something that referenced like an old style flip phone, right? And so by moving the hinge farther down on her piece of metal, she was able to get something that stops. This particular hinge sample would be if you wanted something to lay flat. And so the hinge is also moved down onto the piece. While it's closed, it sits there, but then you see how it can open. Hopefully that's showing up in the camera too. So what I need to do is I need to create a seat for my hinge. Right now, I have all of these round cylinders. And if you envision this is like a giant version of what we're talking about. We have something that's round, and we're going to solder that to something that's flat. Now, that is not a very strong joint. You see that there is a tiny point of contact. You're putting a surprisingly high amount of force on a hinge, right? You have all of this distance out here with a lot of leverage. And so if this solder seam isn't as strong as it can possibly be, you risk tearing this thing apart when you go to open it. So instead of me having my piece of tubing sitting on a flat surface, I'm going to file that edge so that it's a curved surface, so that I have drastically more surface contact, which is going to create a much stronger, much better solder seam. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by taking my edge that I'm going to attach the hinge to. I'm going to file a 45. Okay, and then I'm going to do the other side. Okay, so I have two 45-degree lines. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to very carefully put these together, and I'm going to clamp them in my bench vise. And then I will use my round needle file to file that round trough in there. So this is a little hard to see, but because I have that 45 filed into each side, now I have a nice V-shaped trough. It's going to make it a lot easier for me to file with the needle file because now it has something to hold into. Now it's really important when you're filing with the needle file that you don't rock back and forth, because what can happen then is you'll create gaps at the two ends of your pieces of metal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stand up to make sure I'm nice and tall so that I can get my arm in the proper location, and then I'm going to focus when I'm filing on filing in the middle, because naturally I'm going to get the ends. You want to be really careful that you don't fall out and that you're going nice and straight. Just going to double check my fit. Well, that looks great. I have a nice even trough that has a nice curved seat to it. So now I can get ready to prepare for solder. Okay, so what I need to do to prepare to solder this is I need to put white out on everything that I don't want the solder to go on. It really doesn't matter. So I think for this one, I'm going to start by soldering 3 knuckles down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by putting white out on completely on the 2 knuckles. Now what the whiteout does is it kind of intentionally makes everything dirty. And actually, you know, this is one of those cases where I prefer whiteout as to liquid paper. I just think the liquid paper doesn't work as well. What I'm doing is I'm completely covering the 2 knuckles, and then I'm carefully coming down with the whiteout and getting it on the hinge pin close to that middle knuckle. Hopefully you can see this in the camera. Then I'm going to take my remaining 2 knuckles, I'm going to squeeze everything together. And open these up slightly so that I can get some more on the hinge pin. Then I'm going to get the very ends of the hinge pin. Now I got some whiteout on some of the knuckles that I want to solder. That'll be okay. I can scrape it off very easily. That's one of the benefits of whiteout. You know, if you get it somewhere that you don't want it or don't need it, it comes off very easily. It also dries pretty quickly, so I'm not even going to bother setting this down. I'm just going to wait a few minutes. Since it dries so fast, you want to get in the habit of always putting the lid back on. Oh, it drives me crazy when I find out my whiteout has all dried up. The next thing I need to do is choose one of these pieces and put whiteout all over where the seam is going to be. So I'm going to go a complete layer of whiteout there, on the seam, and even on the outside. Now the whiteout is not a guarantee. You can still solder everything together. So make sure you give yourself ample time to address any issues. Expect to have to make your first practice hinge a few times. So I'm going to let this dry, and then I'm going to get set up to solder. So I'm over here at the soldering area, and I have this set up. What you'll notice is both pieces of metal are stacked on top of each other, and since my hinge knuckles are actually a little bit wider than the thickness of my metal, I carved a little trough into the soft brick. Because I'm able to do that, I can lay this out flat and solder. If I wasn't able to do that, I would have to solder this vertically, which isn't a problem. It can just be kind of challenging to get that little piece of solder to stick where you want it to. Another thing that I've done that's a little bit different from how we normally do it is I've only used a small amount of flux for each knuckle. What I'm going to do is I'm going to heat my metal from the back first. The sheets of metal are drastically larger than the knuckles. So if I started heating right on that solder seam right away, the knuckles would get up to soldering temperature a lot faster than the sheets of metal, and then the solder would just flow on the knuckles. So I'm only using one piece of solder for each knuckle. I don't want to risk the solder flowing to where I don't want it to go. Okay, so the solder just flowed on the sheet. time it just flowed onto the knuckle. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop. I have quite a buildup of solder on that last knuckle, and I don't want to risk soldering everything together. I have two knuckles that are kind of tacked down. They aren't completely soldered by any means. So I'm going to quench, pickle, and then get that last one to go again. So I've just taken my hinge out of the pickle, and I need to dry it off and I need to inspect it. The best way to dry it off is to take it completely apart, but you want to be super careful when you do that, because if you notice, there is just the tiniest piece of solder that's holding everything together. Also, I'm going to go ahead and make a new knuckle for this one that has all this solder on it. There's so much solder on there that I worry about it running everywhere, and also it's a lot to clean up later. So it's going to be easier for me just to take this one off, discard it, and cut a new one. That's a benefit of remembering what your measurement was. Remember, my measurement for these was exactly 1 centimeter. So that's going to make it really easy to cut another hinge, a hinge knuckle. So I'm going to very carefully slide these out. I'm going to take my hinge pin and very carefully try to figure out which direction it wants to go. Like I said, you know, you need to be very gentle with these steps because you don't want to knock anything out of alignment and you don't want to rip one of those off. So now that I got this all apart, I can reapply my whiteout, and I'm going to go ahead and apply whiteout on these two solder seams because I don't want them to flow, and put whiteout basically everywhere on this piece of metal except for that one little spot right there where I'm going to solder. Okay, so I now have whiteout everywhere that I don't want solder to flow. I have my new knuckle cut right there, and I have whiteout on my other piece. I'm just going to take a minute to let these dry and get set up to solder this last knuckle back on there. All right, I'm back at the soldering area. I'm going to apply just a small amount of flux on that last knuckle. So that I can solder that last one. This is a kind of what is a little bit of a pain with making hinges. Every single time you solder or do anything, you basically have to have the entire thing set up. So waiting for the whiteout to dry, reapplying your flux, all of that stuff, you know, that's what can kind of take some time with this process. So just like before, I need to heat the back of this piece of metal. I need to get this whole piece of metal hot before I come in and try to start soldering. Now that the whole thing is hot, I can start focusing in on my solder seam. Okay, that solder seam is complete. So I need to put everything back into the pickle so I can solder the remaining 2 knuckles onto the other sheet. Now that I have it's essentially tacked everything together, I'm going to do my complete solder seam. So you can see in the video here, we just have a teeny bit of solder right there, a teeny bit of solder right there, and a teeny bit of solder right there. So what I need to do is I need to get the solder to completely flow. So what I've done is I've taken the 2 halves of the hinge apart, but I still need my hinge pin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get this set back up. I'm going to flux the knuckles and then get them to solder completely. And I don't know if I mentioned, I have whiteout only on the hinge pin because I don't want that to get soldered in there. Put this back into my little groove so nothing moves. I'm still going to be starting my solder, starting my heat from the back here. Okay, I'm gonna go quench and then I'll do the other side. quench and pickle, and then we'll see how we did. Okay, so here are my pieces fresh out of the pickle. I could probably stand to go back into this and solder this. I see a little gap right there, and this one isn't completely filled. This side looks pretty good. Looks like there might be a slight gap right there. But for demonstration's sake, I'm not going to bother going back into that. This also obviously would be filed and sanded. You know, there's little bits of solder there. But with my new hinge pin in, you can see that this closes completely like I wanted it to. Every single time I went back in to solder this, I had to put white out on that hinge pin, and I had to get it completely set up like before. I didn't need to have both sides. So when I was going back to finish adding more solder and things like that, I was still doing it one half at a time, but every single time I had my hinge pin in and I had these set on the brick on my little groove so that nothing moved, nothing shifted. Okay? So there is our sample functioning 5-knuckle hinge.